Welcome to Audio Mentors. Today, we begin with a comprehensive summary of the fascinating book Antifragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Through this book, we will explore a revolutionary concept, antifragility, which teaches us not only how to survive but how to thrive amidst chaos and uncertainty. Throughout this journey, we will discover how adversities can make us stronger and how to apply this idea to our lives to grow through challenges. Get ready to challenge what you know about risk, change, and well-being. Let's dive into the first chapter, Between Damocles and Hydra, where we start to understand how fragility and antifragility shape our world. Have you ever thought that some things, instead of breaking or weakening under stress, actually become stronger? Taleb takes us on a journey to discover that there are systems, ideas, organizations, and even people who not only survive adversity but grow stronger because of it. In this book, we will learn how to apply this principle to our own lives and decisions, enabling us to thrive in a world full of uncertainty and chaos. Throughout this journey, Taleb challenges us to question our beliefs about what is robust, resilient, and sustainable. He shows us how fragility can be a dangerous characteristic, while antifragility may be the key to surviving and thriving during difficult times. Without further ado, join me in the first chapter, where we are introduced to the concept of antifragility through two powerful metaphors, the sword of Damocles and the Hydra, both of which help us understand how fragility and antifragility manifest in the world around us. Chapter 1. Between Damocles and Hydra. In this opening chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb introduces the central concepts of fragility and antifragility through two powerful metaphors from classical culture. These metaphors not only help us understand Taleb's philosophical ideas but also serve as a guide for applying these concepts to our lives. The sword of Damocles, exposed fragility. The story of Damocles is an ancient fable that represents the concept of fragility. According to the legend, Damocles, a courtier of King Dionysius II, envied the monarch's power and wealth. One day, Dionysius offered to trade places with him for a day, allowing Damocles to experience the luxury and opulence of the throne. However, while Damocles enjoyed his new position, he realized that a sharp sword hung above his head, suspended by a single strand of horsehair. The sword of Damocles serves as the perfect metaphor for how many systems we consider stable and secure in life are, in reality, fragile and vulnerable. Fragility is revealed when something is exposed to risks and uncertainties without the ability to adapt or grow stronger in response. Systems, institutions, businesses, and even individuals can appear secure, yet live under an invisible, constant threat. Damocles enjoyed a day of opulence but was constantly aware that the sword could fall at any moment. Similarly, in the modern world, our structures and lifestyles are full of hidden risks. Although everything may seem in order, the slightest change or unforeseen event can cause everything to collapse. Stress and uncertainty are inevitable, and if we are not anti-fragile, that stress can destroy us. The Hydra, the power of anti-fragility. In contrast, Taleb introduces the Hydra, the multi-headed mythological monster, to illustrate the concept of anti-fragility. The Hydra, as described in Greek mythology, is a creature capable of regenerating its heads. For every head cut off, two grow back in its place. This characteristic makes the Hydra a perfect example of what Taleb calls antifragile, something that not only withstands chaos and stress but becomes stronger because of it. In the context of antifragility, adversities and challenges are not merely endured but leveraged for improvement and evolution. Just as the Hydra grows stronger when faced with threats, antifragile systems, people, and ideas benefit from disorder, chaos, and difficulties. These systems do not just survive, they adapt, grow, and thrive. Taleb applies this metaphor to various aspects of life, from businesses to economies, suggesting that we should build systems, institutions, and mindsets capable of thriving in the face of uncertainty. Anti-fragility becomes a way to develop a strategic advantage over fragile systems that collapse at the slightest setback. How do these metaphors relate to our daily lives? Taleb invites us to think about our own lives in terms of fragility and anti-fragility. Often, we cling to the idea that security is paramount. However, Taleb suggests that this constant pursuit of security may actually make us more fragile. By striving for a life free of risk and uncertainty, we create systems and attitudes that cannot withstand the inevitable pressures of life. For instance, in finance, Taleb highlights how many investment strategies aim to avoid risk at all costs, which ironically makes them more vulnerable to significant losses when unexpected events occur. Similarly, businesses that try to predict and control every aspect of their environment often become highly fragile, as they fail to adapt well to unforeseen changes. Instead, Taleb proposes an approach that embraces uncertainty, seeks to expose our systems to controlled challenges, and learns to adapt quickly. This approach not only builds resilience but fosters growth and strength in the face of chaos. To adversities. Instead of seeking absolute stability, we must strive for antifragility, which allows us to grow through difficulties. Chapter 2. Overcompensation and Overreaction Everywhere. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb introduces the concept of overreaction and explains how it often becomes one of the main causes of systems becoming more fragile. Taleb reveals that when a system faces a crisis or disruption, an excessive reaction to solve the problem can worsen the situation in the long run. Taleb analyzes how human interventions, in economic, political, and even social spheres, frequently fail when attempting to control or eliminate risk. Instead of strengthening the system, these interventions lead to overcompensation, which, rather than stabilizing, creates greater fragility. For example, Taleb mentions that when governments or institutions try to prevent all possible risks, they actually end up creating systems that are unprepared to handle the unexpected. By attempting to make these systems more perfect, they soften their boundaries and make them more vulnerable. The pursuit of total risk elimination is inherently dangerous because uncertainty is inevitable, and we must learn to adapt to it. The author also points out that overreaction during crises is not limited to large or complex systems. It also occurs in everyday situations. In our personal lives, when we overreact to a difficulty with excessive control, we often generate an exaggerated response that worsens the situation. Whether we seek a quick fix or try to avoid all discomfort, these reactive behaviors prevent us from learning to manage difficulties with resilience. Taleb highlights how fear of risk and the pursuit of absolute security lead to policies and behaviors that may seem correct in the short term but undermine our ability to thrive in the long term. Total security can result in systems unable to adapt when circumstances change unexpectedly. It is like trying to make something overly safe without recognizing that natural adaptation to change is what truly makes it strong. One of the key takeaways from this chapter is that fragility arises when we attempt to eliminate all risk. Instead, Taleb encourages us to accept that risk is necessary and, in many cases, beneficial. An anti-fragile system, as demonstrated in the first chapter with the metaphor of the Hydra, not only withstands stress and adversity but also grows stronger by confronting them. Thus, overcompensation and the pursuit of absolute control can actually strip systems of their flexibility and adaptability. Taleb emphasizes that, rather than eliminating risks, we should learn to manage and leverage uncertainty. It is preferable to have systems robust enough to endure shocks and capable of learning and evolving from difficulties rather than systems overly protected that collapse under unexpected changes. Finally, Taleb underscores the importance of humility in the face of uncertainty. The more we try to control and predict outcomes, the more fragile we become. It is crucial to acknowledge that significant changes often emerge from chaos and unpredictability. Instead of fighting risk, we must learn to live with it, adapt to it, and use it to grow stronger. Chapter 3. The Cat and the Washing Machine. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb explores the relationship between what he calls the complex and the simple, using everyday examples to illustrate how antifragility operates at different levels. Through two metaphors, the cat and the washing machine, Taleb shows how systems that appear fragile can actually be far more resilient than we imagine, while those we believe to be secure or robust can easily fall apart. Taleb begins with the story of the cat. Cats, by nature, are incredibly resilient and adaptable creatures, capable of falling from great heights and landing without significant injury. While we might think their fragility relates to their size or structure, the truth is that cats, due to their flexibility and agility, possess an innate ability to adapt to rapid changes in their environment and survive extreme situations. On the other hand, Taleb compares this to the washing machine. At first glance, the washing machine appears to be a sturdy, reliable appliance designed to last. However, it is a highly vulnerable system when faced with unpredictable changes. If a washing machine experiences a disruption, such as an overload, a technical malfunction, or even an unusual vibration, it can easily break. This contrast challenges our understanding of risk and fragility. While simple systems like a cat's body seem fragile, they are often better equipped to adapt and thrive in extreme conditions than complex systems that we perceive as more robust. Taleb introduces the concept of implicit fragility, an idea that complex systems tend to conceal their vulnerabilities until it is too late. Complicated and highly specialized structures often fail when confronted with unforeseen uncertainties, simply because they are not designed to handle the variety and adaptability that randomness requires. The critical point Taleb wants to highlight is that simple things are often far more anti-fragile than those that appear sophisticated. A cat, for instance, has a flexible structure and can adapt to a range of changing environments, whereas a washing machine, though designed for a specific task, breaks down quickly when pushed beyond its intended limits. In daily life, people often underestimate simplicity and focus on complexity, believing that complex things are more robust and reliable. Taleb challenges this assumption, arguing that, not foreseen. In contrast, informal markets, such as bazaars, thrive in uncertainty because they are decentralized, adaptive, and rely on organic interactions. Chapter 3. Simplicity as an advantage. Taleb suggests that simplicity, rather than being a flaw, can be an advantage because it allows for better adaptability and resilience against the unexpected. In this chapter, Taleb emphasizes that antifragility does not depend on complexity but on adaptability. Antifragile systems not only survive shocks and volatility but benefit from them, like a cat that adjusts mid-fall and lands unharmed. The key lies in becoming more adaptable and flexible instead of striving to build systems that are impervious to everything. Taleb invites readers to reflect on their lives and institutions. Rather than constructing massive, complex structures that often fail under pressure, we should opt for simpler, robust, and adaptive systems. Sustainability doesn't come from the absence of chaos but from our ability to adapt and grow alongside it. This chapter challenges us to rethink what we perceive as fragile versus anti-fragile, highlighting simplicity as a powerful source of resilience and adaptability in the face of uncertainty. Chapter 4. What kills me makes others stronger. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb explores the central idea that failure and adversity are not only inevitable but can also serve as sources of strength and resilience. Taleb uses this premise to delve deeper into the concept of antifragility, showing how some systems and individuals not only survive adversity but grow from it. Taleb begins by observing that individuals and systems that avoid risk and hardship fail to develop the capacity to adapt to change, making them more fragile. Anti-fragile systems, on the other hand, not only withstand difficulties but benefit from them. He explains that people who face challenges, whether personal, professional, or social, can emerge stronger if they learn to handle adversity effectively. The author provides a key example to illustrate his theory: medicine. Instead of viewing diseases as purely negative, Taleb suggests that illnesses and injuries offer opportunities for the body to strengthen itself. When the body fights off a disease, it adapts to new threats, thereby fortifying its immune system. This process, while painful, makes the organism more resistant to future infections. The concept of antifragility also applies to social and economic levels. Taleb notes that major economic crises and social inequalities can lead to positive changes in a society's structure. Adversity forces societies to adapt and evolve, discovering new organizational methods, ideas, and solutions that might not have been possible otherwise. Like a muscle that grows stronger through exercise, societies and organizations become more robust when exposed to high-pressure situations. The author critiques the modern mentality of avoiding failure at all costs. In many societies, there is a deep fear of failure, leading to constant efforts to prevent it through excessive regulations, insurance, or guarantees aimed at eliminating any form of risk. However, Taleb argues that this approach has disastrous long-term effects, as it prevents systems from learning from their mistakes and evolving. Taleb urges us to think about fragility and anti-fragility in terms of natural processes, where adversity plays a fundamental role in growth and strengthening. For example, plants don't thrive when always protected from harsh weather. Stress from drought or wind can cause roots to grow deeper, making the plant more resilient. On a personal level, Taleb encourages us not to fear failure or difficulty. Our culture often teaches us to avoid pain and suffering, but this approach ultimately makes us more fragile. The key is to face challenges, learn from them, and emerge stronger. This requires not just the ability to recover from adversities but also the capacity to thrive amid them. The author also notes that anti-fragility is not merely about resilience. It is something deeper, the ability to grow and evolve as a direct result of chaos, conflict, and stress. Taleb gives the example of how great innovations and scientific advancements often emerge from moments of crisis and pressure. Thus, anti-fragility transcends mere resistance, leading to transformation and creation. Finally, Taleb reminds us that anti-fragility should not be seen as an isolated phenomenon. Instead, it is a principle that can be applied to any system or structure that benefits from exposure to uncertainty, risk, and adversity. Rather than seeking a life free of difficulties or a society without challenges, we should learn to navigate chaos in a way that strengthens us and makes us more adaptable. This chapter emphasizes how difficulties and failures are not just part of life but may be essential for growth. Anti-fragility teaches us that by confronting the unexpected and the challenging, we become stronger, wiser, and better prepared for future obstacles. Chapter 5. The Bazaar and the Office Block. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb introduces the idea that anti-fragility is not only found in complex, organized systems but also in the simplicity of markets and everyday human interactions. Taleb compares large corporations and centralized systems to informal markets, such as bazaars, which are far more robust in the face of uncertainty and crises. Taleb describes how centralized institutions like large companies or governments often create systems that, despite appearing strong due to their size and organization, are actually fragile. These systems have little room for flexibility and adaptation, making them vulnerable when unforeseen situations arise. In contrast, informal markets, such as bazaars, thrive in uncertainty because they are decentralized, adaptive, and rely on organic interactions. Unexpected arise. Large corporations, for instance, attempt to foresee and control every possible risk, making them susceptible to miscalculations and systemic failures. In contrast, Taleb uses the example of bazaars, informal markets where interactions are small, decentralized, and based on local adaptation. In these environments, participants have a remarkable ability to adjust to changing circumstances without the need for centralized oversight or strict rules. Taleb argues that such informal markets are far more anti-fragile because they are designed to constantly evolve and respond flexibly to changing consumer needs and environmental conditions. The key concept Taleb conveys is that the fragility of centralized systems stems from their pursuit of perfection and control. By attempting to minimize all risks, large systems lose their ability to adapt to crises or disruptive innovations. For example, a large company reliant on a stable and predictable business model may find itself trapped when conditions change, as it is not designed to be flexible in the face of uncertainty. Taleb also notes that businesses and systems operating in free markets or decentralized environments have an advantage because the stress and chaos they face do not destroy them but instead strengthen them. These systems possess a natural capacity for evolution. As they encounter failures or challenges, they adapt, learn from their mistakes, and become more resilient over time. This chapter also offers a sharp critique of centralization and bureaucracy. Taleb explains how centralization in large institutions tends to create weak points that can collapse under excessive pressure. Governments and large corporations often implement control policies that, though well-intentioned, undermine the adaptability and resilience of systems. Taleb also highlights the role of innovation, suggesting that disruptive innovation tends to arise in decentralized systems where ideas flow freely and actors can experiment without restrictions. In the context of bazaars and informal markets, ideas and business models can be tested quickly and flexibly, allowing the system to evolve and adapt far more rapidly than in a bureaucratic or centralized environment. The author emphasizes that what makes decentralized systems more resilient is not only their ability to adapt to crises but also their capacity to experiment without fear of failure. Antifragile systems do not fear mistakes. Instead, they use them as opportunities to learn and improve. This mindset of constant experimentation and continuous learning is essential for surviving and thriving in an uncertain world. Taleb concludes this chapter by reflecting on how we should apply these principles of antifragility to our own lives. Rather than trying to avoid everything that causes discomfort or pain, we must learn to adapt to chaos and use it as a source of growth. Whether in relationships, careers, or finances, the ability to adapt to change and seize opportunities arising from uncertainty makes us stronger in the long run. This chapter invites readers to reflect on large, centralized structures that often aim to avoid chaos, while smaller, decentralized systems can use it to grow and strengthen themselves. Chapter 6, Randomness, but not too much, is wonderful. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb delves into randomness, one of the most crucial concepts for understanding antifragility. Taleb explains how life and the systems we live in are infused with uncertainty and randomness, and how our relationship with these factors determines our ability to adapt and thrive. Taleb begins by noting that, although people generally tend to avoid uncertainty and randomness, true antifragility arises from controlled exposure to these elements. Randomness should not be viewed as exclusively negative or destructive but rather as a force that can be harnessed to strengthen systems. However, Taleb clarifies that not all randomness is beneficial. It's not about exposing oneself to all kinds of chaos but about learning to recognize which types of randomness can benefit us and which can destroy us. In this context, Taleb distinguishes between positive and negative randomness. Positive randomness refers to situations that can be leveraged for gain, such as when a system benefits from unexpected changes. An example of this is economic crises, which can create opportunities for innovation and the emergence of new business models. Conversely, Taleb explains that negative randomness refers to events that cause harm without any compensatory benefit. Disasters such as natural catastrophes or accidents do not provide opportunities for growth or positive adaptation. According to Taleb, the problem lies in the fact that many modern systems are designed to avoid randomness, which, instead of making them stronger, makes them more fragile. To illustrate this point, Taleb uses the example of finance. In the investment world, many strategies attempt to predict and eliminate risk and uncertainty. Yet, rather than protecting investors, these strategies can make them more vulnerable when unforeseen events occur. Predictive models, which aim to eliminate randomness, often destabilize markets because they rely on past data that fails to account for unexpected events. In contrast, Taleb advocates for the concept of controlled exposure to randomness. He explains that we should learn to make uncertainty an ally by engaging in small bets or experiments that allow us to capitalize on positive randomness. These experiments expose us to small risks that can yield significant rewards. This approach embodies antifragility. Rather than avoiding all risks, we expose ourselves in a controlled manner to grow stronger from unpredictable experiences. Taleb also discusses the importance of understanding that randomness is not the same as absolute chance. Randomness is an inherent characteristic of complex systems, but it does not mean everything is entirely out of our control. The key lies in adapting to uncertainty and being able to harness it in ways that benefit us. Taleb uses the example of gyms to illustrate how consistent small efforts, such as exercise, expose people to small doses of stress, allowing them to grow and strengthen. Similarly, by exposing ourselves to controlled doses of uncertainty, we can grow and adapt without being destroyed by chaos. A central theme of this chapter is the critique of information overload and excessive planning. Taleb argues that as people attempt to predict the future or eliminate all randomness, they become more fragile. The most successful and resilient systems are those that embrace uncertainty and randomness as a fundamental part of their functioning. This does not mean being fully exposed to all forms of chaos, but rather learning to take advantage of the unexpected and adapt to it. The chapter concludes with a reflection on how great advancements and innovations often emerge from situations of chaos or disorder, when a system is in a state of controlled disorganization. The key is not to fear randomness but to learn to live with it, expose the system to uncertainty in a controlled manner, and be ready to seize opportunities when they arise. Antifragility, in this sense, is the ability to grow from chaos rather than be destroyed by it. This chapter invites us to rethink our relationship with randomness. Instead of trying to eliminate risk and chaos, Taleb teaches us to accept and leverage them to build more resilient and adaptive systems. The key is not to fear uncertainty but to learn to navigate it intelligently and in a controlled way. Chapter 7. Naive Intervention. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb examines the phenomenon of intervention in complex systems and how, in many cases, poorly guided interventions can make matters worse. Taleb emphasizes that while intervention is often perceived as a quick solution to a crisis, such actions often destabilize the system further, making it more fragile in the long run. Taleb begins by describing what he calls naive intervention, referring to the tendency of authorities, experts, or governments to intervene to fix what they perceive as system failures without considering the unforeseen consequences of their actions. These interventions can range from economic policies to social regulations aimed at eliminating chaos or risk within a system. The author points out that, in most cases, these attempts at control strip a system of its ability to adapt to uncertainty, weakening its resilience and often creating new problems. One example Taleb uses to illustrate this concept is government bailouts of failing companies during an economic crisis. When a government intervenes to rescue a bankrupt company to prevent its collapse, it masks the inherent fragility of that system. The company is not forced to face the consequences of poor management or failed strategies and, therefore, has no incentive to improve or adapt to new realities. Instead of allowing the system to self-correct, the intervention creates an illusion of stability, but in reality, it increases the likelihood of a larger collapse later when accumulated fragility finally implodes. Taleb stresses that rather than attempting to eliminate chaos, we should allow systems to learn from their mistakes and evolve. Naive intervention, though well-intentioned, suppresses the natural self-correction that many systems need to strengthen their structures and become more antifragile. A system that is intervened in is often more fragile because it does not have to face the difficulties that would allow it to adapt and grow. A core concept in this chapter is the idea of letting systems test their resilience instead of smoothing over every error or difficulty. Taleb suggests that a system constantly shielded from risk becomes incapable of dealing with uncertainty because it has never had to adapt to challenges. This type of intervention, which seems protective, actually undermines the system's ability to develop resilience and adaptability. Taleb also highlights that naive intervention is often based on an overly simplified view of the world. Experts frequently underestimate the complexity and nonlinear dynamics of systems, leading to misguided decisions. For example, traditional economic models, which attempt to predict outcomes and fix system errors, fail to account for unforeseen uncertainties that can radically change the situation. The author warns that excessive confidence from experts and interventions based on such confidence tend to create more problems than solutions. The more we try to predict and control the outcomes of a complex system, the more likely we are to interfere with natural adaptation processes, leading to a cycle of fragility. Taleb also reflects on how this interventionist mentality has infiltrated daily life, from personal decisions to business management. Often, we try to control every aspect of our lives or businesses to prevent anything from going wrong. But in doing so, we strip these systems of their ability to adapt. True strength does not come from the absence of difficulties but from the ability to adapt to them. Rather than seeking quick fixes and external controls, Taleb suggests we should allow systems to operate naturally, face challenges, learn from failures, and adapt to the unexpected. This is the essence of antifragility, What does not kill us makes us stronger, but only if we allow ourselves to learn from experience and face chaos head-on. The chapter concludes with a call to rethink our relationship with control and intervention. Taleb invites us to embrace uncertainty and allow systems to evolve autonomously without trying to fix everything that seems out of place. By making systems more open to randomness and chaos, we give them the opportunity to grow stronger rather than weakening them with unnecessary interventions. This chapter demonstrates how naive intervention can do more harm than good, and how true antifragility emerges when we allow systems to face uncertainty and adversity in order to learn from them. Chapter 8. Prediction as a Child of Modernity. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb addresses the concept of prediction and how the obsession with forecasting the future has led to the fragility of many systems. Taleb argues that prediction is a tool that often creates a false sense of control over the uncertain and the unpredictable. Instead of preparing us for the unexpected, prediction leads us to trust models that ignore unknown risks, ultimately making us more vulnerable when things do not follow the expected course. Taleb begins by describing how modern society has developed a culture of prediction, aiming to foresee the future through mathematical models, algorithms, and analysis. In fields such as economics, politics, and science, efforts are made to predict future events with a high degree of certainty. However, Taleb contends that these models are inherently limited because they cannot anticipate extreme events, what he calls black swans, which are unpredictable and have a disproportionate impact on systems. A central point Taleb highlights is the fragility of prediction. The more we rely on our ability to forecast the future, the more vulnerable we become when predictions fail. Taleb critiques experts and analysts who claim to know the future based on past data, failing to account for the fact that uncertainty is a constant in any complex system. According to Taleb, antifragile systems do not attempt to predict the future but are designed to be flexible and adaptive, capable of handling the unexpected and even benefiting from unanticipated events. Taleb also introduces the idea that excessive reliance on prediction weakens our ability to respond to real challenges. By placing too much faith in predictions, we may diminish our capacity to adapt to unforeseen events. This approach creates false confidence and a sense of security that, in turn, makes us more vulnerable when unexpected events occur. Rather than preparing us for uncertainty, predictions lead us to underestimate and ignore real risks. Throughout the chapter, Taleb emphasizes how many predictive models rely on extrapolating from past events. However, the past does not guarantee the future, and complex systems are subject to unexpected changes. Taleb explains how predictive models often fail to account for extreme events that, while rare, can have dramatic consequences. These models normalize the unpredictable and, in doing so, erase the reality of uncertainty. Instead of relying on predictions, Taleb proposes a mindset focused on resilience and anti-fragility. Rather than trying to control the future, we should create systems that are robust against shocks and capable of leveraging randomness to evolve. Taleb uses examples from nature, economics, and history to illustrate how systems overly focused on prediction often fail when faced with the unpredictable. A key point Taleb develops is the importance of living with uncertainty. By attempting to eliminate it through predictions, we suppress the opportunities that may arise from the unexpected. Taleb advocates for a more pragmatic and flexible approach, where instead of trying to guess what will happen, we develop strategies that allow us to adapt and take advantage of any events that occur. This approach, as he describes, better prepares us to face black swans and become more anti-fragile. Taleb also highlights the idea that practical wisdom does not come from predictive models but from direct experience and the ability to learn from mistakes. The world is complex and cannot be predicted linearly, so our ability to learn and adapt through experience and action is far more valuable than any mathematical model. Finally, Taleb invites us to reflect on the danger posed by experts who predict the future and how, more often than not, these predictions misinform us and make us more fragile. Instead of trusting predictions, we should focus on strengthening our ability to adapt to the unexpected and leverage randomness to our advantage. True wisdom is not about predicting the future but about thriving amid uncertainty. This chapter challenges us to question our reliance on predictions and encourages us to adopt a more flexible and adaptive stance toward an uncertain future, transforming uncertainty into a source of strength and growth. Chapter 9. Fat Tony and the Fragilistas. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb introduces a fictional character, Fat Tony, to illustrate his concept of fragilistas. Taleb uses Tony to show how fragile systems may appear successful in the short term but are, in reality, built on a false sense of security that makes them vulnerable to collapse at the most unexpected moment. Fat Tony exemplifies someone who benefits from minimal exposure to risks but crumbles when faced with real uncertainty. Taleb presents Fat Tony as an individual who outwardly appears highly successful in his ventures. Tony has managed to accumulate substantial wealth quickly through strategies that seem intelligent and safe. However, the true nature of his success lies in a system that, while appearing robust, is actually highly fragile. The key point is that Tony has not been tested by the real uncertainties of the world. His success is built on a protected foundation where risks are minimal and impulsive decisions are made without significant consequences. Taleb uses this character to emphasize a critical insight. Systems that are too secure or built without accounting for real risk tend to be more fragile in the long term. Although Fat Tony seems to be in control, he is, in fact, exploiting circumstances to avoid chaos and shield himself from risks that could expose his fragility. This mindset of seeking absolute safety is what makes systems, and people, vulnerable. Taleb highlights that while Fat Tony may temporarily thrive, his foundation lacks the capacity to endure shocks or adapt to adversity. This chapter serves as a warning against placing too much emphasis on superficial success and ignoring the underlying fragility that lies beneath systems seemingly shielded from uncertainty. Leads many to build systems that, though seemingly solid, collapse when faced with unpredictable events or black swans. Taleb explains that fragilists, unlike antifragile systems, avoid risks at all costs and prefer systems that are predictable and controllable. However, by doing so, these systems not only lose the ability to adapt but also miss out on the growth opportunities that come with exposure to risk. By avoiding stress and chaos, fragile systems become incapable of handling tension when it arises, and that is when collapse occurs. In this sense, Taleb invites us to reflect on how the pursuit of security is, in fact, one of the greatest mistakes we make when designing systems, businesses, and even in our personal lives. True strength does not come from avoiding risk but from exposing ourselves to it in a controlled manner. Only through gradual exposure to challenges and controlled failures can we strengthen ourselves and learn to effectively handle uncertainties. Taleb also criticizes institutions, public policies, and corporations that, in their attempts to avoid chaos and disorder, end up creating more problems than they solve. Governments and large companies often intervene excessively to shield people from risks, but instead of protecting them, they make them more vulnerable to unexpected shocks. This intervention, rather than mitigating fragility, merely conceals it, creating a false sense of security that, when shattered, leads to even worse consequences. The key concept of this chapter is that true resilience does not come from avoiding risk or making everything predictable but from the ability to learn and adapt to the unexpected and leverage randomness. Taleb urges us to abandon the mindset of fragilists and adopt an anti-fragile approach, which not only tolerates uncertainty but thrives on it. Taleb also emphasizes that anti-fragile people or systems are those that, while they may face difficulties, have the capacity to use them to grow and improve. Unlike Tony the Fat, who lives in a bubble of artificial security, anti-fragile systems face adversity with the confidence that they will ultimately benefit from it. To close this chapter, Taleb leaves us with a powerful reflection on how fragility is, in many cases, a deception that gives us a false sense of security. True strength, he tells us, lies in accepting uncertainty, learning from mistakes, and knowing how to adapt and grow amid chaos. This chapter perfectly illustrates how an excess of security and the pursuit of stability can lead to fragility and an inability to adapt. Taleb challenges us to question our beliefs about risk and to understand that only through controlled exposure to chaos can we strengthen systems, organizations, and, of course, ourselves. Chapter 10. The Positive and Negative of Seneca. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb draws on Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher, to explore how Stoicism can help us develop an anti-fragile mindset. Taleb takes inspiration from Seneca's teachings to argue that suffering and adversity are not only inevitable but can also strengthen people if faced with the right attitude. Taleb begins by highlighting a key concept of Stoic philosophy, the idea that we must learn to face adversity in ways that strengthen us rather than weaken us. Seneca teaches that difficulty and stress are a natural part of life and that if we accept and adapt to them, we can emerge stronger. According to Taleb, this principle aligns perfectly with the idea of antifragility. Systems and people that are antifragile not only resist chaos but benefit from it. Taleb also examines how the Stoics, led by Seneca, advocated for the self-imposition of suffering as a way to train the mind and body. The Stoics recommended that people voluntarily expose themselves to discomfort and pain to learn to manage them better. This deliberate practice of adversity aims to make people more resilient to life's inevitable challenges, preparing them to face the unexpected without breaking. In this context, Taleb mentions a crucial concept from Seneca, the willingness to be stripped. Seneca believed that people who are unwilling to face adversity or who fear losing what they have, such as money, status, or comfort, are more fragile in the face of inevitable changes. Conversely, those who learn to voluntarily let go of their possessions or comforts and live with less are stronger because they do not depend on external circumstances for their well-being. This act of freeing oneself from dependency is a form of training anti-fragility, as it enables people to better adapt to life's ups and downs. Taleb also refers to the concept of the low tide in business and life, which posits that crises and disasters are not only inevitable but necessary for systems to evolve and improve. Just as the sea reveals obstacles and rocks when the tide recedes, life's difficulties expose what truly matters and allow us to reconfigure our priorities. Taleb explains that people who face adversity with a growth and learning mindset will be able to take advantage of these opportunities to strengthen themselves. In the modern world, Taleb criticizes the tendency to shield oneself from suffering and constantly seek comfort. According to him, the avoidance of stress and the desire for stability create an environment in which people and institutions become more fragile because they are not accustomed to dealing with uncertainty or change. Taleb proposes that, instead of trying to eliminate suffering or avoid difficulties, we should embrace these experiences as opportunities for growth and improvement. Throughout this chapter, Taleb emphasizes that controlled suffering is an essential component of personal growth. By consciously learning to endure discomfort, people can increase their resilience and acquire practical wisdom that cannot be gained otherwise. This is something the Stoics, like Seneca, deeply understood. Deeply understood, adversity is not only a challenge but also an opportunity to evolve. Finally, Taleb emphasizes that antifragility is not just a philosophical or theoretical concept but a practical tool we can apply in our daily lives. Just as Seneca taught that controlled stress is beneficial, Taleb encourages us to seek opportunities to deliberately expose ourselves to difficulties that allow us to grow, learn, and adapt in stronger and wiser ways. This chapter highlights the importance of adversity and controlled suffering as essential means to achieve greater anti-fragility. Taleb invites us to adopt a mindset similar to that of the Stoics, who not only accept uncertainty but embrace it as a source of strength and growth. Chapter 11. Don't Marry the Rock Star. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb reflects on the relationship between fragility and the excessive concentration of power or resources in a few entities or individuals. Taleb uses the example of the rock star to illustrate how placing too much trust or dependence on a single source of power or success creates fragile systems that can collapse at any moment. Taleb begins by explaining how major stars or public figures, like rock stars, are seen as power centers in their respective fields. In social and economic systems, these figures are often placed in positions of great influence. However, Taleb warns that this type of power concentration is not only dangerous but destabilizes the system as a whole. When everything revolves around a single figure or entity, the failure or collapse of that figure dramatically impacts the entire system. One example Taleb uses to explain this concept is monopolies or companies that exercise excessive control over a market. In a monopolized market, the instability of the central figure can have devastating effects on the entire system. Companies that depend too heavily on a single leader, such as founders or stars in various industries, risk future collapse due to their lack of resilience to change. Taleb draws a parallel with antifragile systems, which avoid excessive reliance on any central element. Instead of depending on a single entity or individual, an antifragile system has multiple points of resilience and adaptability. This means that if one point fails, the system as a whole can continue to function without collapsing. The strongest systems do not depend on rock stars but distribute risk and resources across various entities and factors, providing greater flexibility and less exposure to collapse. Taleb also critiques what he calls the star effect in organizations. This effect occurs when, instead of fostering teamwork and a diversity of skills and talents, a single figure is placed at the center of everything, expected to solve all problems and lead all projects. This approach creates a vulnerability gap where the entire system depends on the success or failure of one person. Taleb warns that although these figures may succeed in the short term, their long-term negative impact can be catastrophic. The author points out that the collapse of the rock star is not just a personal issue but has repercussions for the entire system. In the case of large companies, the downfall of a leader or the loss of a central icon can cause the entire organization to lose its direction because the system was not designed to adapt without relying on a single central figure. As a result, the system becomes vulnerable to emerging changes and may be unable to recover. Taleb also introduces the idea that unpredictability is an essential part of antifragile systems. In an unpredictable world, the most resilient systems are those that are not built around a central figure but consist of multiple elements that can quickly adjust to changes. These systems can leverage change, chaos, and uncertainty, while centralized systems break when faced with unforeseen events. Failure is not a disaster in an antifragile system. It is an opportunity to learn and improve. Rather than seeking stability through authority figures and centralized control, Taleb proposes an approach based on distributing responsibility and influence. By doing so, we not only reduce the vulnerability of systems but also increase their capacity to adapt to changes. This approach is not only more resilient but also opens the door to more constant and sustainable innovation. Finally, Taleb calls on us to shift our focus away from the leader or rock star and instead build decentralized systems that promote diversity of ideas and actors. These systems, far from collapsing under the weight of a single figure, can leverage chaos and change to become stronger and more adaptive. This is the principle of antifragility, the ability to use adversity to grow stronger. This chapter challenges us to rethink our dependence on central figures and recognize that the most resilient and adaptive systems are those that do not rely on a single star. Instead of building on individual figures, we should build on diversity, adaptability, and the distribution of responsibilities to create more antifragile systems. Chapter 12: The Ripe Grapes of Thales. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb reflects on the concept of optionality and how, rather than trying to predict or foresee the future, we should build systems and make decisions that offer open options and flexibility. Taleb uses the example of Thales of Miletus, a Greek philosopher who, according to legend, amassed great wealth by using his knowledge of weather and markets to invest in crops and achieve significant profits. Taleb uses this example to show how creating options is much more valuable than predicting future events. Thales didn't need to know exactly when or how the harvest would be good, but he took advantage of the possibility of acting when conditions were favorable. Thales' optionality allowed him to capture large benefits without needing to accurately guess the future. According to Taleb, this principle should be applied in our daily decisions, both personally and professionally. The concept of optionality involves the ability to make small bets that can yield large rewards in the future, without losing much if things go wrong. Through this approach, Taleb encourages us to avoid rigid commitments and seek ways to keep our options open. Instead of betting everything on a single prediction or direction, we should invest in options that allow us to adapt and respond to any unforeseen change. Taleb emphasizes that anti-fragile systems are those that have multiple options and can take advantage of any unexpected event. The more options we have, the less we depend on predictions, and the more resilient we are to fluctuations and unforeseen circumstances. This concept also applies to investments, where the key is not to put all capital into a single asset but to maintain a diversified portfolio that allows us to benefit from the unexpected. Moreover, Taleb criticizes systems that try to predict the future based on models and fixed assumptions. These systems, although seemingly robust, tend to be fragile because they cannot adapt to surprises. Instead, by keeping multiple options open, we ensure that we are prepared for the unexpected and can respond to changes without being destroyed by them. Taleb also introduces the idea that uncertainty and randomness are allies when we expose ourselves to multiple options. Instead of trying to predict outcomes, opening up options allows us to explore new possibilities without taking on a great risk. A system based on options can be much more flexible and robust than a system that depends on a specific prediction. For example, Taleb mentions startups in the business world. Startups don't need to foresee total success from the outset. Their strength lies in having many small opportunities they can take advantage of. Some of these initiatives fail, but others become great successes, which more than compensate for the losses. This optionality gives them the ability to explore risks without significant consequences. Finally, Taleb encourages us to shift our mindset from predict and control to keep options open. Instead of being tied to a single course of action, we should focus on leveraging uncertainties and opportunities that arise without committing too much to a single idea. This way, our decisions become anti-fragile strategies that grow and improve with chaos, rather than being destroyed by it. This chapter invites us to rethink our decisions and approaches, suggesting that instead of focusing on predicting the future, we should create open options and maintain flexibility to take advantage of any unexpected opportunity that arises. The principle of optionality is key to living anti-fragile, leveraging uncertainty rather than fearing it. Chapter 13. Teaching Birds How to Fly. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb criticizes the human tendency to overestimate our knowledge and impose solutions on problems that should, in fact, be solved organically. Taleb uses the metaphor of teaching birds how to fly to illustrate how, often, we try to interfere in processes that are inherently natural and, if allowed to evolve on their own, would be much more effective and resilient. Taleb argues that natural systems and organic solutions tend to be much more effective and adaptable than artificially imposed or external solutions. For example, he refers to how biologists or experts often try to optimize or modify natural processes when what they should do is allow the system to evolve on its own. By trying to teach birds how to fly, rather than letting them fly naturally, we create a system that loses flexibility and adaptability. Taleb compares this to modern society, where interventions often take place in natural processes of learning, development, and growth. For instance, in education, educational systems often try to force a style of teaching, instead of allowing students to learn at their own pace and according to their nature. Taleb reminds us that the ability to learn and adapt is rooted in human nature and many other systems, and by imposing external solutions, we risk losing that self-adjustment capacity. Taleb emphasizes that the antifragility of systems often arises from their ability to evolve spontaneously and take advantage of changing conditions without anyone having to impose a course of action. This self-adjustment process allows systems to adapt to difficulties and grow stronger over time. The author also reflects on how, in the modern world, many institutions and systems insist on predicting and controlling what should be the natural outcome of evolution. However, what makes anti-fragile systems so effective is that, rather than trying to control everything, we simply give them space to evolve and learn from their own mistakes. Taleb mentions historical examples, such as the evolution of currencies and markets, which were not created by centralized planning but evolved organically through the interaction of millions of individuals. Similarly, the strongest societies and organizations are those that allow for spontaneous innovation and constant adaptation, rather than imposing prefabricated solutions. In the business world, Taleb points out that large corporations often try to optimize every aspect of their operations to maximize efficiency, but in this process, they lose flexibility and adaptability. Small businesses, on the other hand, often have a greater capacity for adaptation and can take advantage of opportunities that arise unexpectedly, something large companies cannot do due to their rigidity. Taleb concludes this chapter by suggesting that, instead of imposing our solutions, we must learn to trust natural processes and allow evolutionary systems to grow on their own. Antifragility is not something we can impose. It is something that emerges when we allow systems to be flexible enough to take advantage of uncertainty and grow with it. This chapter encourages us to question our tendency to impose artificial solutions and urges us to allow systems, people, and organizations to evolve organically, learning from their own mistakes and adapting to uncertainties in an anti-fragile way. Chapter 14. When two things are not the same. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb explores the idea that fragility and antifragility are not binary properties, but exist on a spectrum of gradients. Through this chapter, Taleb invites us to reflect on how we should treat complex systems and individuals differently depending on their nature, flexibility, and ability to adapt to uncertainty. Taleb begins by pointing out that not all things that seem similar are truly the same. This concept refers to the essential difference between the robust and the anti-fragile. Many times, when we look at systems, structures, or people, we mistakenly classify them as either simply robust or fragile, but the true nature of a system can be much more complex and dynamic. Antifragility is not just the opposite of fragility. It is an active state in which systems not only withstand disturbances but actually grow stronger from them. Taleb uses several examples to illustrate this difference. One of the most representative examples is the distinction between robust things and antifragile things. Robust things, such as certain financial systems or individuals, can withstand an impact without breaking, but they do not improve with the impact. Meanwhile, antifragile systems not only survive impacts but benefit from them. For example, the human body is an antifragile system because it adapts and strengthens when faced with physical or mental stress, as seen with exercise or mental challenges. Taleb criticizes the human tendency to try to homogenize responses to problems. Instead of understanding that each system is unique, we often try to impose universal solutions that do not take into account the particular characteristics of each case. For instance, medical treatments and financial strategies often rely on a standard model, assuming that all individuals or systems will react in the same way to stress or challenges, but the reality is that each one has a unique response to tensions and risks. Taleb also introduces the concept of asymmetry to explain the importance of understanding that not all losses and gains are the same. Some losses are small and recoverable, but others are disproportionate and devastating. At the same time, gains are not always linear. Opportunities can be much greater in anti-fragile systems than in robust ones. The asymmetries that occur between systems, investments, or life decisions can offer great rewards if leveraged correctly, but only if the system is designed to absorb impacts without collapsing. In the case of financial markets, Taleb argues that traditional prediction models, which attempt to predict market behavior based on what has already happened, ignore the possibility of black swan events or extreme events. These models, instead of making the system more robust, make it more vulnerable. Anti-fragile systems, on the other hand, do not fear volatility but leverage it. Taleb also questions conventional wisdom that says economies, institutions, or even individuals need to be predictable and stable in order to be successful. Instead of trying to create artificial stability, Taleb suggests that true wisdom lies in learning to live with uncertainty and chaos, adapting to challenges rather than trying to avoid them. Anti-fragility teaches us that systems that can face chaos and emerge stronger are the ones that truly thrive. Taleb also reminds us that we must take into account the unpredictability of the events around us. Life and the market are not predictably linear. Therefore, one of the keys to thriving is to keep options open, maintain flexibility, and be ready to adapt to uncertainty. In this context, anti-fragile systems not only resist shocks and crises, but actually benefit from them. Taleb concludes the chapter by suggesting that antifragility is a completely and radically different principle from fragility or robustness. Instead of focusing on prediction, we should look for ways to ensure that systems not only survive but actually become stronger in the face of unexpected events. This chapter invites us to understand that systems, people, and organizations have unique characteristics that must be understood and treated differently. Instead of imposing uniform solutions, we must adapt and take advantage of uncertainty to generate anti-fragility in all aspects of our lives. Chapter 15. The History Written by the Losers. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb invites us to reflect on how history and knowledge have been constructed over time, and how, often, the losers or forgotten events are the ones that have truly had a significant impact on the world. Taleb argues that official history tends to focus on the winners and big visible events, while failures and small stories, which actually make up the true history of humanity, are often overlooked. Taleb begins by highlighting how historical common sense usually focuses on the great figures and successful events, while ignoring ordinary people and failed events that have influenced the evolution of systems. He tells us that failures and untold stories are a crucial part of anti-fragility, as failures often contain valuable lessons that allow us to learn and adapt. By focusing only on the successes of history, we miss lessons that could make us stronger in the face of the unexpected. Taleb argues that history is full of black swans, improbable events and challenges that, by their nature, are invisible or underestimated when they occur, but have a profound impact on the development of societies, economies, and cultures. These events are often forgotten or overlooked in historical accounts, leading to a distorted view of reality. Taleb illustrates his point with historical examples, such as major catastrophes or economic disasters that were unforeseen and do not feature prominently in history books, but had a decisive impact on the course of events. Often, history is told in a way that favors those who overcame difficulties, while those who did not succeed or could not adapt properly fade into obscurity. However, Taleb maintains that anti-fragility resides in those events and people who failed or were forgotten because they offer the most valuable lessons for surviving in an uncertain world. This chapter also invites us to rethink how history is written and transmitted. Historical narratives often favor the winners or great leaders, but the true lessons come from those who were forgotten or who lost along the way. Taleb suggests that failures should not be seen as negative events, but as sources of learning that allow us to identify the weaknesses of systems and correct them before the damage becomes irreversible. Taleb also refers to the complexity of systems and how small events, minor failures, or imperceptible adjustments are often what bring about true long-term change. The history of humanity is full of forgotten or invisible events, but these small events have caused systems to adapt and evolve over time. The great winners are not always the ones who created lasting changes, but those who knew how to leverage circumstances and learn from failures. Taleb argues that, instead of focusing only on the successes of great leaders, we should study failures and forgotten events with more attention. Through these failures, we can learn to strengthen systems and find new ways of adaptation and growth. In other words, true historical wisdom does not lie solely in what succeeded, but in what was lost, failure after failure, and how those losses contributed to collective learning and the evolution of systems. Taleb concludes this chapter by emphasizing that history written by the losers is one of the most valuable ways to learn anti-fragile lessons. Instead of glorifying success alone, we must study both failure and success, and recognize that great failures contain the seeds of anti-fragility and the future innovations and adaptations that emerge from them. This chapter highlights how small and failed events often contain the most valuable lessons, and how history, as we know it, tends to overlook these crucial moments. Taleb encourages us to view failure as an opportunity to learn and adapt, and not to rely solely on the accounts of the victors to understand the true dynamics of history. Chapter 16. A Lesson in Disorder. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb explores the concept of disorder and how, far from being something negative or chaotic, disorder can be a fundamental driver for the growth and evolution of systems. Taleb argues that, instead of trying to eliminate chaos and uncertainty, we should leverage them to strengthen systems and, ultimately, ourselves. Through the concept of anti-fragility, he invites us to view disorder as a positive force that makes us stronger. Taleb begins this chapter by describing how organized systems, when they become too structured and rigid, can lose their capacity for adaptation. As systems become more predictable and controllable, they stop being resilient to changes, as they cannot adapt to the unexpected. Fragility arises when a system loses the ability to take advantage of moments of chaos and disorder. In contrast, Taleb underscores that anti-fragile systems not only resist disorder but actually benefit from it. Chaos and disturbances are not seen as threats, but as opportunities for growth and improvement. Disorder, far from being a threat to be eliminated, is an essential component for the evolution of any system, whether an organization, an economy, or even an individual. Taleb invites us to accept uncertainty and disorder as natural forces that transform us. Taleb also explains that resilience and adaptability are characteristics of systems that have learned to face adversity and disorder. Financial markets, economies, and organizations that are too structured and predictable lose this capacity for adaptation. For example, government interventions or excessive regulatory policies can reduce the flexibility of a system, making it more vulnerable when disorder arises. Taleb points out that, rather than intervening to try to eliminate uncertainty, institutions should focus on strengthening their ability to adapt to crises and chaos. Through the concept of antifragility, Taleb reminds us that systems that can take advantage of disorder are the ones that truly survive and become stronger. Instead of fearing chaos, we should learn to use it as a tool to evolve. Taleb notes that historically, great innovations and technological advances often arise during times of disorder and crisis, when old structures collapse and new opportunities emerge. Taleb also makes a distinction between natural disorder and artificial disorder. While natural disorder can generate growth and adaptation, artificial disorder, created by misguided interventions or lack of foresight, tends to weaken systems and destroy the capacity to adapt. For example, attempts to predict and control the future too rigidly can cause a system to lose the ability to leverage surprises or adapt to unforeseen changes. Taleb emphasizes that we must cultivate flexibility and open our minds to the possibility of the unexpected. Instead of building systems that are too predictable, we should learn to work with uncertainty and unpredictability. By accepting disorder, we can create systems that become more robust and adaptive, capable of thriving amid confusion. Finally, Taleb reflects on the importance of diversifying our strategies and approaches instead of relying on a single solution. Diversification allows systems to absorb disorder and uncertainty without collapsing. By keeping multiple options open and being willing to experiment with new ideas, we can navigate chaos and emerge stronger. This chapter challenges us to change our perspective on disorder. Rather than fearing it and trying to eliminate it, we must learn to harness it as a force that strengthens systems, people, and organizations. Antifragility teaches us to adapt to chaos and grow with it, rather than being destroyed by it. Chapter 17. Tony the Fat Man debates Socrates. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb uses a fictional conversation between Tony the Fat Man, a character representing traditional thinking on security and control, and Socrates, the philosopher who advocated for knowledge through self-examination and critical reflection, to illustrate the tension between fragility and anti-fragility. Through this dialogue, Taleb aims to show how traditional ideas of security and stability tend to create fragile systems, while a more philosophical and adaptive approach to uncertainty can generate more anti-fragile systems. The discussion begins with Tony the Fat Man, who is convinced that total security and the absence of risk are essential for a successful life. Tony argues that to prosper, one must predict the future and plan every step, avoiding any form of chaos or uncertainty. To him, the perfect life is one in which risks are minimized and outcomes are guaranteed. According to Tony, total control over events is the only way to ensure a stable and prosperous future. Socrates, on the other hand, challenges Tony with a completely different perspective. Socrates does not believe that absolute security is either possible or desirable. Rather than avoiding uncertainty, Socrates argues that true wisdom lies in accepting the uncertainty and unpredictability of life. According to Socrates, systems and people who seek total control and unbreakable security become fragile because they rely on a predictable environment that cannot exist in a complex world. Socrates explains that anti-fragile systems are not those that avoid chaos, but those that grow and strengthen through it. Anti-fragile systems do not fear disorder, but leverage it to adapt and evolve. In contrast, systems that try to suppress chaos and predict all events tend to be more fragile, as they lose the ability to adapt to the unexpected. Socrates tells Tony that, just like a muscle grows stronger with exercise and controlled stress, systems and people become stronger when they face stress and uncertainty in ways that allow them to learn and adapt. Anti-fragility comes from controlled exposure to adversity, which allows systems not only to survive but also to benefit from the difficulties they face. Throughout the dialogue, Socrates points out that Tony the fat man focuses too much on the fear of the unexpected and the pursuit of predictability, making him vulnerable. In contrast, thinkers who adopt the anti-fragile mindset are willing to open their minds to the uncertain and the unpredictable. These thinkers do not simply aim to endure adversity but are open to learning from it and growing with it. At the end of the chapter, Taleb uses this debate to highlight a fundamental truth. Fragile systems are those that rely on absolute certainty and risk avoidance, while anti-fragile systems are those that accept and leverage uncertainty. In this sense, Socrates represents the view that uncertainty and lack of control are not things to fear but opportunities to grow and learn. Only by accepting chaos and unpredictability can we build a future that is not only capable of withstanding but benefits from the unexpected. This chapter highlights the difference in approach between security and growth through chaos, and invites us to reflect on how our strategies for dealing with uncertainty can determine whether we become more fragile or anti-fragile. Chapter 18. One Big Stone and 1,000 Small Stones. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb explores the difference between large and small systems and how fragility and anti-fragility manifest differently in these systems. Taleb uses the metaphor of a large stone versus 1,000 small stones to illustrate how large systems tend to be more fragile due to their size and complexity, while smaller systems can be more resilient to unexpected shocks. Taleb begins by comparing two types of systems: the large system, represented by a single big stone, and the smaller system, represented by 1,000 small stones. A large system is more vulnerable because it has less flexibility to adapt to changes. This system may be robust in the short term, but when it faces an unexpected shock, its size and complexity make it more prone to collapse. Taleb gives the example of large corporations and centralized economies, which, despite their power, often lack the ability to quickly adapt to rapid changes or unforeseen events. In contrast, smaller systems, such as small businesses or decentralized systems, are more resilient to chaos because they are less interconnected and more flexible. While they may be more vulnerable to short-term changes, they have a great capacity for adaptation as they face crises because they can quickly adjust and take advantage of opportunities that arise amid disorder. The 1,000 small stones represent an approach that has a greater capacity for change and growth from uncertainty. Taleb also introduces the concept that, although smaller systems may seem weaker or less stable, they have a significant advantage when it comes to resilience and adaptability. Large systems often become trapped in their hierarchical and controlled structure, making it difficult for them to react to unexpected events. Smaller systems, on the other hand, being more agile and decentralized, have a great advantage in an uncertain world because they can take advantage of small variations and quickly adjust to new conditions. Taleb uses historical examples of decentralized economies or informal markets, such as souks or local economies, to illustrate how these systems survive and thrive through their ability to adapt to change. Although these economies may appear more disorganized than large centralized systems, they are more resilient because they do not rely on a single central entity to make decisions. In the case of small businesses, Taleb points out that, while they may be more vulnerable to short-term failures, they have a significant advantage when it comes to adapting to the changing needs of the market. Large corporations often try to predict and control the entire business process, which makes them more fragile when unforeseen events disrupt their plan. Small businesses, being more flexible, can seize opportunities as they arise. One of the key ideas Taleb emphasizes is that centralization and the pursuit of absolute control tend to make large systems more fragile, while decentralization and the distribution of power in smaller systems allow the entire system to be more resilient. Taleb warns that fragility does not only stem from the size of a system but from its internal structure. A centralized system, although it may seem stronger due to its size, is vulnerable to failures in its central core. A decentralized system, on the other hand, has better recovery capacity because it does not depend on a single point of failure. Taleb also introduces the idea that, in a world full of uncertainty, it is preferable to build resilient systems that are capable of leveraging chaos and disorder. Smaller systems, despite their limitations, have a great advantage in this regard, as they are more capable of adapting and evolving over time. Taleb highlights the importance of not fearing small failures, as they are what strengthen systems and allow them to grow in the face of adversity. This chapter emphasizes the importance of flexibility and adaptation in contrast to the fragility of large systems. Taleb reminds us that smaller, decentralized systems have a far greater capacity to grow and thrive in an uncertain world than large, centralized systems that rely on prediction and control. Rather than seeking absolute stability, we should focus on creating systems that are antifragile, meaning that they learn from and become stronger through chaos and disorder. Chapter 19. The Illusion of Knowledge. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb delves into the topic of knowledge and how the illusion of knowledge can make systems and people more fragile. Taleb argues that, instead of relying on predictions based on limited or incomplete knowledge, we should embrace uncertainty and recognize that overconfidence in our predictions can be dangerous. Through the metaphor of a limited knowledge, Taleb warns that the more we think we know about something, the more vulnerable we can be to mistakes. Taleb explains that one of the greatest dangers in the modern world is overconfidence in our ability to predict the future. According to him, the illusion of knowledge is a common phenomenon in many fields, from science to economics. Experts in various areas tend to make predictions based on models that simplify the complexity of the real world, believing that their conclusions are definitive and reliable. However, Taleb points out that these models cannot predict the extreme events and surprises that truly determine the fate of systems, whether economic, political, or social. Taleb uses the example of economic models that attempt to forecast market behavior, and how these models often fail to account for black swan events, unpredictable occurrences with a large impact. Despite economists using vast amounts of data to make predictions, Taleb argues that uncertainty and unpredictability are inherent parts of any complex system, and that attempts to control these factors only generate fragility. The chapter also addresses the theory of uncertainty and how, instead of trying to predict the future, we should adopt a mindset of acceptance in the face of the unknown. Taleb advocates for the idea that, instead of obsessing over absolute knowledge, humility in the face of the unknown is much more useful. Accepting that we don't know everything and that there are limits to our knowledge allows us to better adapt to surprises and seize opportunities when they arise. Taleb also critiques the excessive specialization in the modern world. Highly specialized experts may have deep knowledge in their field, but often lack the ability to see the big picture or adapt to new circumstances. In contrast, generalists, those not limited by excessive specialization, often have better adaptability because they are less susceptible to the biases of specialized knowledge and can take advantage of opportunities in areas that were not foreseen. The author argues that intellectual humility is one of the most valuable qualities a person or system can possess. Rather than thinking we know everything and can predict the future, we should recognize the importance of the unpredictable and learn to leverage uncertainty. Taleb maintains that, instead of trying to eliminate uncertainty, systems should be designed to grow with it, that is, to be antifragile. One of the key ideas Taleb introduces in this chapter is the concept of the two types of knowledge. Taleb distinguishes between practical knowledge, based on experience and direct observation of the world, and theoretical knowledge, which often relies on mathematical and abstract models that do not reflect the complexity of the real world. Taleb suggests that practical knowledge is much more valuable because it is directly linked to reality and better adapts to changing conditions. Finally, Taleb concludes this chapter by emphasizing the importance of experience and humility when making decisions. Excessive knowledge or the illusion of control can make us more fragile by not allowing us to adapt to unforeseen changes. Instead of basing our decisions on predictions that give us a false sense of certainty. Taleb invites us to embrace the unknown, be open to uncertainty, and accept what we do not know. This chapter underscores the idea that the illusion of knowledge leads to a false sense of security, while intellectual humility prepares us to face uncertainty and makes us more anti-fragile. Taleb urges us to recognize the limits of our knowledge and adapt, rather than try to control the uncontrollable. Chapter 20, Antifragility in Everyday Life. In this chapter, Nassim Nicholas Taleb brings the concept of antifragility to everyday life, showing how we can apply this principle to strengthen our decisions and well-being in the face of uncertainty, chaos, and adversities presented by the modern world. Taleb argues that by adopting an anti-fragile mindset, we can learn to thrive amid difficulties, rather than be defeated by them. Taleb begins by highlighting that anti-fragility is not an abstract concept but a practice we can integrate into our daily lives. The key to creating an anti-fragile life is learning to take advantage of risks and mistakes instead of trying to avoid any form of uncertainty or confusion. Taleb makes an important distinction between resilience, which means resisting damage, and anti-fragility, which means growing from damage, encouraging us to view difficulties as opportunities to improve and adapt. Taleb also introduces the concept of small exposures to stress, which are key to improving anti-fragility in everyday life. Through controlled exposure to challenges, we can learn to handle them better when they arise more intensely. This approach applies to various aspects of life, from physical exercise to emotional development. Taleb points out that the human body strengthens when exposed to small doses of stress as part of physical exercise, and the same occurs in other areas of life, such as relationships or work. By regularly facing small difficulties, we learn to manage stress and become more resilient. Furthermore, Taleb discusses how modern life strategies tend to be too focused on safety and control. People, especially in more developed societies, seek to eliminate any form of uncertainty from their lives, which makes them more vulnerable to the unexpected. Taleb calls for challenging this mindset and embracing the opportunities that arise from uncertainty. Instead of trying to predict and control every aspect of our lives, Taleb invites us to learn to adapt and progress through randomness. Taleb also criticizes the approach of modern society to education, which is often based on the idea that stability and certainty are essential for success. Rather than preparing students to face challenges and learn from mistakes, the education system tends to prioritize safety and prediction. Taleb argues that true wisdom and personal development come from exposure to challenges, where individuals learn to adapt to the unexpected. A key example Taleb uses in this chapter is that of financial markets. Instead of trying to predict market fluctuations, Taleb suggests that investors should adopt an approach of diversification and controlled exposure to risk. Rather than putting all their money in one safe investment, they should maintain a portfolio of assets that allows them to seize opportunities when markets experience unexpected fluctuations. This approach not only makes individuals more resilient to economic changes but also allows them to grow when black swan events arise. Taleb also discusses the fear of failure in modern societies. The fear of making mistakes or failing in our efforts makes us more fragile because it prevents us from taking risks and learning from challenges. Taleb points out that failures are necessary for learning and growth. Only when we face mistakes and overcome them can we acquire greater practical wisdom and adaptability. Taleb asserts that anti-fragility is closely tied to the willingness to fail, as only through failure can we learn the important lessons that will allow us to thrive. The chapter concludes with a reflection on how the anti-fragile life is not about avoiding problems but confronting them with a growth mindset. Taleb invites us to embrace uncertainties, adapt to unpredictable circumstances, and learn to flourish in chaos. By doing so, we not only survive life's challenges but become stronger and more capable of thriving as the world continues to change around us. This chapter invites us to live in a more adaptable and open way to risks, adopting a mindset that leverages uncertainties and learns from failures. Instead of trying to avoid disorder, we should seek how to grow and evolve with it, applying the principles of anti-fragility to our everyday lives. And so we conclude this journey through the concept of anti-fragility. As we've explored throughout this book, the key to thriving in a world full of uncertainty, chaos, and disorder is not to try to eliminate those factors, but rather to learn to take advantage of them to strengthen ourselves and grow. By understanding the nature of anti-fragile systems, we can apply this principle not only in our investment decisions but also in our daily lives, relationships, and mental health. The world is unpredictable and extreme events, black swans, are inevitable. However, by accepting uncertainty, keeping options open, and being willing to adapt, we can transform what threatens us into a source of strength. Instead of running from risk, we can learn to live with it in a way that allows us not just to survive but to thrive. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you've enjoyed this content, I invite you to continue exploring and learning about how to bring the concept of anti-fragility to all areas of your life. Subscribe to the channel, share this audiobook with those you think will benefit, and continue advancing on your path to a more resilient, flexible, and above all, anti-fragile life. See you in the next book.